Rachael Scarlett Mullenix grew up in a household that, on the surface, looked like an ordinary suburban family. She was the daughter of Barbara Mullenix, a woman who had worked hard to raise her children and keep her family together. Barbara was described as caring but also strict, a mother who tried to impose rules and discipline on her teenage daughter. To friends and neighbors, Barbara seemed devoted, while Rachael appeared to be a bright but restless young woman struggling to find her identity during adolescence. It was during these turbulent teenage years that Rachael became romantically involved with Ian Allen, a relationship that would drastically alter the course of her life and eventually end in tragedy. The relationship between Rachael and her mother was complicated and often strained. Barbara wanted to maintain control and guide her daughter through what she saw as reckless behavior, but Rachael increasingly resisted her mother's authority. Arguments between them became frequent. Barbara's insistence on discipline clashed with Rachael's desire for freedom. Like many teenagers, Rachael wanted to explore relationships, independence, and experiences outside her mother's control, but the tension in their home escalated far beyond the usual parent-teen disputes. Over time, resentment built up inside Rachael. She began to view her mother less as a protector and more as an obstacle to the life she wanted. When Ian Allen entered Rachael's life, he provided the validation and companionship she felt was missing at home. He was a few years older and represented rebellion, excitement, and escape. Rachael became deeply attached to him, seeing their relationship as a refuge from her mother's strict household. Barbara, however, did not approve of Ian and strongly opposed their involvement. She viewed him as a bad influence, someone who encouraged her daughter's defiance and pulled her further away from family values. The more Barbara tried to intervene, the closer Rachael and Ian became, creating a cycle of conflict that worsened the mother-daughter relationship. As Rachael invested more of her emotional energy into Ian, her bond with her mother grew weaker, replaced with hostility and a desire to break free. Together, Rachael and Ian began to live a lifestyle fueled by teenage rebellion, secrecy, and risky decisions. By September 2006, the household tensions had reached a breaking point. Arguments between Barbara and Rachael were growing louder and more hostile. Rachael felt increasingly trapped, and with Ian's influence, her resentment turned darker. Rather than seeing reconciliation or compromise as an option, she started to envision a life completely free of her mother's control. Conversations with Ian fed into these thoughts, and the two began to plot a drastic solution. The days leading up to the murder were marked by escalating anger, emotional instability, and the dangerous reinforcement of their shared plan. What could have remained a troubled but reparable family conflict was transformed into something deadly as Rachael and Ian fixated on the idea of removing Barbara from their lives permanently. On the night of September 13, 2006, the plan was carried out in a brutal and violent way. Inside the Mullenix home, Barbara was attacked with shocking savagery. She suffered 52 stab wounds, a frenzied assault that reflected both rage and premeditation. One of the most disturbing details was a butter knife lodged in her eye, a sign of the cruelty and chaos of the attack. After the killing, Rachael and Ian attempted to cover up their crime. They wrapped Barbara's body in a blanket, transported it from the home, and disposed of it in Newport Harbor. The attempt to conceal the murder was clumsy, but it showed how far the young couple had gone in their desperation to eliminate Barbara from their lives. The discovery of the body shocked the community. Wrapped in a blanket and left in the harbor, Barbara's remains quickly raised suspicions of foul play. Police began an intensive investigation, carefully gathering forensic evidence and reconstructing the events that had led to the murder. The brutality of the crime, combined with the hurried attempt to dispose of the body, pointed investigators toward people close to Barbara. It didn't take long for suspicion to fall on her daughter and Ian Allen. As the evidence mounted, the story of a troubled home life, a rebellious relationship, and deep resentment toward Barbara began to emerge. Rachael and Ian were soon arrested, and their behavior under investigation only deepened the disturbing picture. During interrogation, both struggled with their stories, shifting blame and minimizing their involvement. At times, Rachael attempted to distance herself from the physical act of the murder, but the evidence tied her directly to the planning and execution. Investigators noted how unusual it was for a young girl to be involved in such a violent and premeditated crime against her own mother. The questioning revealed not only the crime itself but the twisted dynamics that had grown between Rachael, Ian, and Barbara in the months leading up to the killing. The trial that followed was closely covered by the media and drew intense public interest. The prosecution presented the murder as a cold, calculated act driven by resentment and the desire for freedom. They emphasized the brutality of the attack, the number of stab wounds, and the attempt to dispose of the body as proof of premeditation. The narrative painted Rachael and Ian as partners in crime, united against Barbara in a destructive alliance. The defense, however, tried to shift some of the focus onto Rachael's emotional state. They argued that she was a teenager under the influence of an older boyfriend, emotionally manipulated, and overwhelmed by her circumstances. They sought to portray her less as a mastermind and more as a troubled girl swept into a violent situation she could not fully control. Courtroom proceedings highlighted the shocking nature of the crime. Family members, witnesses, and experts testified, painting a picture of a young girl who had grown distant from her mother and allowed anger to override any sense of morality. The jury was left to decide whether Rachael was simply a misguided teenager or a willing participant in a deliberate and vicious murder. After hearing the evidence, the jury reached its decision. Rachael was found guilty of first-degree murder, and she was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. Ian Allen, tried separately, received a similar punishment for his role in the crime. The sentencing closed a chapter in the courtroom but left behind painful questions about how the relationship between a mother and daughter had deteriorated so far. Barbara's family and friends expressed grief and disbelief at the outcome, mourning not only the loss of a mother but also the destruction of a young life. For the community, the case became a chilling reminder of how family conflicts can escalate into unimaginable violence. In prison, Rachael's story continued to draw attention, with media outlets revisiting the case to understand how a teenage girl could participate in the murder of her own mother. Some portrayed her as a cautionary tale about rebellion, toxic relationships, and the dangers of outside influence. Others debated whether her sentence was fair or whether she was more victim than villain, manipulated by an older partner and driven by immaturity. Regardless of perspective, the fact remained that a mother's life had been violently taken and a daughter's future permanently scarred by the choices she made. The Rachael Mullenix case remains one of the most disturbing examples of family conflict turned deadly. It highlights how fragile the bond between parent and child can become under strain and how resentment, when combined with unhealthy relationships and poor judgment, can escalate to extremes. The story of Rachael, Barbara, and Ian is remembered not only for its brutality but also for the tragic waste of lives and the irreversible damage caused by one night of violence. For those who followed the case, it left a lasting impression of how quickly love within a family can turn into hatred, and how that hatred, if left unchecked, can end in tragedy. Nicole Nachtman was a young woman whose life seemed, from the outside, to be on a normal track. She was a student at Florida State University, one of the most well-known institutions in the state. To those who only knew her from a distance, she looked like another college student trying to find her path. But behind that exterior, Nicole was struggling with deep emotional problems, feelings of isolation, and growing resentment toward her mother and stepfather. The story of Nicole is not only about two lives taken in a shocking act of violence but also about the hidden turmoil of a young woman who never found a healthy way to cope with the pressures surrounding her. Nicole had been raised by her mother, Miriam Dines, and lived with her stepfather, Robert Dines, in a Florida suburb. Miriam was known as a strong, caring, and hardworking woman who had high expectations for her daughter. Robert, too, tried to provide a stable home and to guide Nicole as a father figure. But the relationships inside the household were not smooth. Nicole often clashed with her mother, who pushed her to succeed academically and behave responsibly. Miriam was described as strict, setting high standards that sometimes felt overwhelming to Nicole. With her stepfather, the relationship was more distant but generally not hostile. What truly defined Nicole's family life was the tension with her mother, a tension that only grew as she moved into young adulthood. Nicole herself was described by those who knew her as shy, introverted, and socially awkward. Instead of being outgoing, she often retreated into herself, a habit that would eventually make it difficult for her to cope with life's demands. At Florida State University, Nicole's difficulties became more apparent. While many students engaged in social activities and built friendships, she remained isolated. Roommates and acquaintances later testified that she was highly introverted, preferred staying up at night, and often lost herself in computer games rather than interacting with others. This solitary lifestyle reinforced her detachment from the people around her. Academically, she was also struggling. Issues with campus housing, tuition, and deadlines added to her stress. Nicole became anxious about the problems piling up, but instead of reaching out for help, she tried to hide them. One of her deepest fears was how her mother would react if she learned the truth about her struggles. Miriam's strictness, while intended to push her daughter forward, was something Nicole dreaded facing. The fear of disappointing her mother became a heavy weight on her mind, and as time went on, it grew unbearable. By the summer of 2015, Nicole's inner struggles had reached a critical point. She was overwhelmed by her academic and personal problems, and her resentment toward her mother continued to grow. The strict expectations, combined with her own inability to meet them, created a storm of anger and despair inside her. People around her did not notice how deeply she was breaking down. Signs of a mental health crisis were present, but they were hidden behind her quiet and introverted behavior. Nicole felt trapped between her inability to meet her mother's expectations and her terror of being punished or judged for failing. The emotional pressure turned into a sense of hopelessness, and her mind began to spiral toward a violent solution. In August 2015, Nicole carried out the act that would destroy not only her mother's and stepfather's lives but her own as well. Late at night, she returned to her family's home, armed and filled with pent-up anger. Robert Dines was the first victim. Nicole shot him, killing him almost instantly. Afterward, she turned the gun on her mother, Miriam. The attack was swift but devastating, ending both of their lives within moments. The crime scene was chaotic, a suburban home transformed into the site of a double homicide. For Nicole, the murders were the breaking point of years of resentment and fear, unleashed in an irreversible act of violence. After the shootings, her behavior was erratic and detached. Rather than showing clear remorse, she appeared numb, as if unable to fully grasp what she had done. The police arrived quickly after neighbors and concerned individuals reported the incident. Inside the home, officers found the bodies of Robert and Miriam, both killed by gunshot wounds. Forensic teams collected evidence that pointed directly to Nicole. Autopsies confirmed the nature of the deaths and the brutality of what had happened. Neighbors provided statements about the family dynamic and the tension between mother and daughter. What stood out was not just the crime itself but the shocking fact that a young woman had murdered both of her parental figures. Investigators pieced together the background, the resentment, the isolation, the academic struggles, and the fear of her mother's judgment. All signs led to Nicole as the only possible suspect. Nicole was soon arrested, and during interrogation, her emotional state stood out to police officers. She did not present herself as a hardened criminal. Instead, she seemed distant, anxious, and almost disconnected from the reality of her situation. At times, she admitted her involvement, at other times, she appeared to be lost in confusion. Investigators noted that her statements revealed both anger and fear, a strange mix of emotions that reflected the complicated nature of the case. For them, it was clear that Nicole was the one who committed the murders, but the question of why and under what mental condition remained at the center of the investigation. The trial that followed drew widespread media attention. Prosecutors presented Nicole as a young woman who deliberately killed her mother and stepfather out of resentment and frustration. They argued that she knew what she was doing and carried out the crime intentionally. The number of shots fired, the decision to attack both victims, and the attempt to manage her life afterward all pointed, in their view, to a calculated act. The defense, however, painted a different picture. They argued that Nicole was not in her right mind at the time of the murders. Claims of schizophrenia, psychotic breaks, and severe mental illness were brought forward. Expert witnesses testified about her fragile mental state, her long history of introversion and isolation, and how the pressures of her environment may have triggered a breakdown. The courtroom became a stage for two competing narratives, one of a resentful daughter who chose murder, and another of a young woman who lost touch with reality under unbearable pressure. Throughout the trial, the emotional weight of the case was evident. Family members mourned the loss of Miriam and Robert, while observers debated whether Nicole should be seen as a cold-blooded killer or a mentally ill young woman who needed help rather than punishment. The jury listened to days of testimony, balancing the horror of the crime against the possibility of mental instability. In the end, the decision was clear. Nicole was found guilty of the murders, and the court sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The verdict reflected the jury's belief that, regardless of her mental health issues, she was responsible for her actions and had committed the crimes knowingly. The sentencing closed the legal proceedings, but the discussion surrounding the case did not end there. The media highlighted the tragedy of a daughter killing both her mother and stepfather, while experts debated the broader issues of mental health and criminal responsibility. Was Nicole a victim of untreated illness, or was she simply unable to handle the pressures of adult life? Was her punishment just, or did it fail to recognize the role of her fragile mind? For the community, the case left a deep scar. 2 lives had been taken, and a third life, Nicole's, was essentially ended with her imprisonment. The Nicole Nachtman case remains a tragic example of how hidden struggles can escalate to unthinkable violence. It demonstrates the dangers of untreated mental health problems, the impact of academic and family pressure, and the devastating consequences when a young person feels trapped with no escape. The story is one of loss on every side, a mother and stepfather killed in their own home, and a daughter condemned to spend her life behind bars. For those who study the case, it is a reminder that behind quiet, introverted behavior can exist a storm of pain and resentment, and that ignoring the warning signs can sometimes lead to irreversible tragedy. Gypsy Rose Blanchard was born into a world where her life story was carefully crafted by her mother, Claudine D.D. Blanchard. From the outside, D.D. appeared to be a devoted and selfless mother who gave her entire existence to caring for her sick and fragile daughter. Gypsy was presented as a child suffering from a long list of severe medical conditions, ranging from leukemia to muscular dystrophy. She used a wheelchair, had a feeding tube, and endured countless surgeries. For years, friends, neighbors, and even national charities viewed the Blanchards as an inspiring example of perseverance and maternal love. Yet behind this carefully constructed image was a dark reality of control, manipulation, and abuse that eventually led to one of the most shocking true crime cases of the last decade. From her earliest years, Gypsy's life was tightly controlled by D.D. She was kept away from normal childhood experiences like going to school, playing with other children, or forming her own friendships. D.D. claimed that Gypsy's fragile health made such activities dangerous, and she insisted that her daughter be homeschooled and remain largely confined to their home. This isolation kept Gypsy dependent on her mother, not just physically but emotionally. Gypsy was told repeatedly that she was much younger than her real age and too weak to live independently. Every aspect of her existence, her food, her medicine, her social interactions, was dictated by D.D., who ensured that her daughter had no sense of freedom or autonomy. The truth was that Gypsy was not sick in the way everyone believed. D.D. was engaging in a psychological form of abuse known as Munchausen syndrome by proxy. In this condition, a caregiver invents or exaggerates medical problems in someone under their care, usually to gain sympathy or attention. D.D. made doctors believe Gypsy suffered from a long list of illnesses, manipulating medical records and sometimes even convincing healthcare professionals to perform unnecessary surgeries. At different points, Gypsy was given medications she did not need, placed in a wheelchair even though she could walk, and subjected to invasive treatments. The community rallied around D.D. and Gypsy, donating money, building them a house through Habitat for Humanity, and treating D.D. as a heroic mother sacrificing everything for her daughter. In reality, the sympathy and gifts were the result of D.D.'s lies, and Gypsy was trapped in a cycle of fabricated illness and control. The relationship between mother and daughter was defined by fear and dependency. Gypsy had been raised to believe she was too weak and too sick to live on her own. When she questioned her mother or tried to assert independence, Dee Dee often responded with anger or threats. Gypsy later recalled how her mother would restrict her from eating, destroy her belongings, or physically punish her for disobedience. At the same time, Dee Dee controlled all of their finances and communications, ensuring that Gypsy had no resources to turn to. For Gypsy, the only reality she knew was one of obedience and fear, reinforced by her mother's authority and manipulation. Despite this control, Gypsy eventually discovered small ways to experience freedom. She began accessing the internet when her mother was asleep, exploring social media and online communities. For the first time, she could interact with people outside her mother's influence. In 2012, she met Nicholas Gojan through a Christian dating site. The two quickly developed an intense relationship, communicating online and eventually meeting in person. Nicholas, who had his own history of mental and social difficulties, became a source of emotional support for Gypsy. Their relationship gave her a taste of independence, love, and the possibility of a life beyond Dee Dee's control. But it also introduced a dangerous new element into her story, the idea that escape could come through violence. As Gypsy's desperation to break free from her mother grew, she and Nicholas began discussing plans to get rid of Dee Dee permanently. Gypsy felt there was no way to leave her mother peacefully, believing Dee Dee would track her down, expose her supposed illnesses, or punish her severely. The relationship between Gypsy and Nicholas was emotionally intense, and their conversations eventually turned toward murder. Nicholas, deeply infatuated with Gypsy, agreed to carry out the act. Gypsy's emotional state was one of fear mixed with longing for freedom, and she saw the plan as her only chance at escape. On the night of June 14, 2015, the plan was set into motion. Nicholas traveled to the Blanchards' home in Springfield, Missouri, where Gypsy let him inside. While Gypsy hid in the bathroom covering her ears, Nicholas entered Dee Dee's bedroom armed with a knife. He stabbed her repeatedly, killing her in a brutal attack. Dee Dee's death was the violent end to years of abuse and deception. Afterward, Gypsy and Nicholas fled the house, taking some money and catching a bus to Nicholas's home in Wisconsin. For Gypsy, the murder represented both a shocking end to her mother's domination and the beginning of a terrifying new chapter. The discovery of the crime shocked the community. Concern first arose after a series of strange Facebook posts appeared on Dee Dee's account, including one that said Dee Dee was dead. Neighbors, who had long admired Dee Dee's devotion to Gypsy, were horrified and quickly contacted the police. When authorities entered the Blanchard home, they found Dee Dee's body in her bedroom. At first, many feared Gypsy had been kidnapped or harmed, since the girl was believed to be gravely ill and dependent on her mother. The truth was far more shocking. Within days, police tracked Gypsy and Nicholas to Wisconsin, where they were arrested. The investigation revealed the web of lies Dee Dee had woven and exposed the reality of Gypsy's health. For the first time, the world learned that Gypsy could walk, eat normally, and was far healthier than her mother had ever claimed. During interrogation, Gypsy confessed to her role in planning the murder, though she emphasized that Nicholas had carried out the killing itself. Videos of her questioning revealed a young woman who was both relieved to be free of her mother's control and terrified of the consequences. Nicholas, meanwhile, admitted to the stabbing and spoke of his devotion to Gypsy. The case quickly gained national attention, as the shocking details of Dee Dee's abuse and Gypsy's victimization came to light. The story blurred the lines between victim and perpetrator, raising difficult questions about responsibility and justice. In 2016, Gypsy accepted a plea deal and was sentenced to 10 years in prison after pleading guilty to second-degree murder. The deal recognized both her role in the crime and the years of abuse she had suffered under Dee Dee's control. Nicholas Gojan, however, faced a separate trial. In 2018, he was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. The trials were covered extensively by the media, with documentaries, news specials, and dramatizations exploring every detail of the case. The public remained divided. Some saw Gypsy as a cold-blooded conspirator in her mother's killing, while others viewed her as a desperate victim who saw no other way out. The aftermath of the case continued to capture attention long after the verdicts. Documentaries and series highlighted the complex nature of Gypsy's life, examining both DD's psychological manipulation and Gypsy's struggle for freedom. Public opinion remained split, but many expressed sympathy for Gypsy, arguing that she had been more victim than criminal. While in prison, Gypsy began to rebuild her identity, speaking more openly about her experiences and even finding a degree of independence for the first time in her life. In 2023, after serving nearly 8 years of her sentence, Gypsy was granted parole and released from prison. Her release reignited public debate about her story, with some celebrating her chance at a new life and others questioning whether justice had been fully served. For Gypsy herself, the years of abuse, the crime, and her time in prison marked a journey unlike any other. Her story became one of the most discussed cases of the decade, a shocking example of how extreme control and manipulation can push someone to desperate actions, and how the justice system struggles to balance compassion with accountability.